The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying flurries of snow that swirled like ghosts against the darkening sky. Elijah Cutter, a retired forest ranger, pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he trudged through the knee-deep drifts. The Yukon wilderness had been his home for over 2 decades, a place where silence spoke louder than words and the rhythm of nature dictated his days. Solitude suited him. He spent his time tracking wildlife, maintaining trails, and recording the subtle changes in the land through the pages of his worn leather journal. His cabin, nestled at the edge of an old-growth forest, was simple but sturdy, a refuge from the unforgiving northern winters. Tonight, however, something felt off. The snowstorm had rolled in fast, thickening the air with a white haze, but it wasn't just the weather that unsettled him. As he hiked along a familiar ridge, checking for illegal traps left by poachers, a faint sound cut through the wind, a thin, desperate cry. He stopped, heart pounding. The sound came again, barely audible beneath the storm's fury. Not a wolf. Not a bird. Something else. Elijah turned, following the cries deeper into the trees. His boots crunched over ice-crusted snow as the wind stung his face. Then, through the swirling white, he saw it, a lynx, caught in a steel trap. The animal's eyes, wild with pain and fear, locked onto his. Elijah exhaled sharply. He had to act fast. Elijah knelt in the snow, his breath coming in sharp clouds. The lynx lay still, its tawny fur dusted white with frost. The trap's cruel metal teeth had bitten deep into its front leg, and though the animal's golden eyes burned with fear, its body was too weak to resist. "Damn poachers," Elijah muttered under his breath. Years in the wilderness had taught him caution, especially around wounded predators. A lynx, even weakened, could lash out in terror. But he couldn't just leave it. Moving slowly, he reached for the trap, murmuring softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. The lynx flinched but didn't fight. That worried him more than aggression. It was running out of time. With steady hands, he pried the rusted steel open. The lynx whimpered, a raw, broken sound, but as soon as its paw was free, it didn't bolt. It tried, staggering, only to collapse back into the snow. Elijah hesitated. The storm was growing worse, and the animal was too weak to survive on its own. Common sense told him to let nature take its course. Instead, he shrugged off his pack, pulled out an old wool blanket, and wrapped the lynx carefully. It didn't resist, only shivered as he lifted it against his chest. "Looks like we're in this together," Elijah murmured, tightening his grip as he turned back toward his cabin. The wind howled louder, but Elijah kept moving. The lynx's body, frail and cold against his, stirred something deep in him, a quiet urgency, a reminder that even the wildest creatures sometimes needed saving. The first few days were tense. The lynx lay curled in the corner of Elijah's cabin, its golden eyes watchful, muscles taut despite its exhaustion. It never hissed or growled, but its ears remained flat whenever Elijah came too close. He didn't push, just tended to its wound, left food nearby, and spoke in low, steady tones. Elijah had spent his life around wild animals, but this lynx was different. There was something in the way it watched him, not just wariness, but calculation. Intelligence. As if it was trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand it. He began documenting its recovery in his leather-bound journal, noting every sign of improvement. How it limped less with each passing day. How it started licking its fur clean, regaining some of its natural pride. He even gave it a name, though only to himself. Ash. Ash never let him touch it, but tolerated his presence. Each morning, when Elijah placed a plate of venison scraps near the hearth, the lynx would wait until he stepped back before creeping forward to eat. At night, its ears would twitch when Elijah stoked the fire, but it never moved from its spot. Then, one night, something changed. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness outside. Elijah was reading by the fire when he heard it, a low, guttural growl from beyond the cabin walls. His spine stiffened. Wolf? Bear? Something was too close. Before he could react, Ash, who had barely moved all evening, suddenly lifted its head, ears erect. A deep, guttural hiss escaped its throat, followed by a sharp, warning snarl. Elijah grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. Just beyond the flickering light, a dark shape shifted, yellow eyes gleaming in the night. A wolf! Ash's snarl deepened from inside. The wolf held Elijah's gaze a moment longer before slinking back into the shadows, disappearing into the forest. Elijah exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. When he stepped back inside, Ash had already curled up again, its body tense but its eyes flickering with something different. Trust, perhaps. Or recognition. A few days later, the lynx was strong enough to stand tall. Its muscles had filled out again, and the wound had mostly healed. That morning, Elijah left the cabin door open. He didn't try to coax it. He just waited. Ash hesitated at the threshold, staring at the vast, endless wild beyond. Then, without looking back, it leapt forward and was gone. Elijah stood in the doorway, watching the trees swallow the lynx whole. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt emptier. The blizzard had swallowed the world in white. Elijah trudged forward, each step heavier than the last. The wind howled around him, sharp as a blade against his exposed skin. His beard was frozen, his eyelashes caked in ice. He had meant to check the remote trails, just a quick circuit before the next snowfall. But the storm had arrived faster than expected, turning the familiar landscape into a disorienting void. He no longer knew which direction was home. His limbs burned with exhaustion, then slowly, terrifyingly, began to go numb. He clenched his fingers inside his gloves, trying to keep feeling in them. Keep moving. Don't stop. But his body was betraying him, slowing against his will. The cold was sinking into his bones. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the deep snow. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging up in the frigid air. This is how it happens, isn't it? He had seen it before, trappers, hikers, even rangers who thought they were prepared. Hypothermia set in. Then sleep. Then silence. Then, tracks. At first, he thought they were an illusion, some trick of his frozen mind. But no, right there in the snow, half filled by the wind, were paw prints. Not wolf, not fox. Lynx. His sluggish mind barely registered the movement ahead, a shadow against the swirling white. Golden eyes, watching him. A familiar shape, low to the ground, tail flicking. Ash. His voice was barely a whisper, stolen by the wind. The lynx didn't move, just stared. Then, silently, it turned and walked forward. Elijah's body screamed for rest, but some instinct, some deep-rooted trust, forced him to rise. Step by step, he followed. The lynx didn't look back, only kept moving, leaving a trail of prints for him to follow. He focused on them, forcing himself to move, one foot after another, against the pull of sleep. He didn't know how long he walked, minutes, hours, eternity. But then, through the storm, a shadow loomed. His cabin. Elijah stumbled forward, collapsing against the door. He barely managed to push it open before the last of his strength gave out, the warmth swallowing him whole. As his vision blurred, he caught one last glimpse, Ash, standing just beyond the threshold, golden eyes meeting his. Then, just as silently as before, the lynx vanished into the storm. Elijah barely made it inside before his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed near the fireplace, his frozen hands fumbling to pull off his ice-crusted gloves. The warmth of the cabin pressed against him, but it felt distant, his body still trapped in the blizzard's grasp. With shaking hands, he reached for the firewood stacked beside the hearth. It took every ounce of strength to feed the embers, coaxing the flames higher. The heat licked at his numb skin, sending sharp pins and needles through his limbs. He gasped, pain anchoring him back to reality. Through the open door, the wind howled, snow swirling into the cabin. And there, just beyond the threshold, stood the lynx. Its golden eyes watched him, unblinking, ears flicking against the cold. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then, as if satisfied, the lynx turned. Elijah's breath hitched as he watched it vanish into the storm, its pale form melting into the white. He wanted to call out, but his throat was raw, voice lost to exhaustion. Instead, he let his head rest against the floor, staring at the open door. A part of him knew he would see Ash again. Days later, when the storm finally broke, the world outside Elijah's cabin was buried beneath a thick, untouched blanket of snow. The air was sharp and clean, the sky a brilliant blue, as if the blizzard had never raged at all. Stepping onto his porch, still sore and moving slower than usual, Elijah skinned the tree line out of habit. The wind had erased most tracks, but near the spot where the lynx had often rested, something stood out, fresh paw prints. His breath caught. They circled the cabin, pausing near the door before disappearing into the trees. But something else glinted in the morning light. Frowning, he knelt and brushed aside a thin layer of frost. A small, smooth stone lay nestled in the snow, polished by time, shaped by the river, completely out of place in the otherwise untouched landscape. He picked it up, running his fingers over its surface. Elijah exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. A token. A coincidence, perhaps. But deep down, he knew better. Turning toward the forest, he let his gaze linger on the shadows between the trees. He didn't expect to see the lynx, but that didn't matter. Some bonds didn't need words. Didn't need reason. He clutched the stone in his palm and smiled. Somewhere out there, Ash was watching. And that was enough.